In 1962, a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in rural Montana documented something that would haunt her for the rest of her career. 4 brothers, ages 6 through 12, were admitted following what their parents described as a hunting accident. But when Dr. Elizabeth Harmon began her examination, she discovered wounds that defied every principle of medical science she had studied. The injuries appeared to be healing from the inside out, with tissue regenerating at a rate that should have been impossible for human physiology. More disturbing still, the boys seemed to share sensations across their separate bodies. When one brother winced in pain, the others would simultaneously react, despite being in different rooms of the hospital. Dr. Harmon's detailed notes, discovered decades later in a storage facility, revealed her growing unease as she observed the brothers over the following weeks. Blood samples taken from each boy showed identical genetic markers that extended far beyond what siblings should share. Their cellular structure exhibited properties that resembled nothing in existing medical literature. When she attempted to send samples to the state laboratory for analysis, the specimens would mysteriously degrade within hours of leaving the hospital, as if exposure to outside environments caused some kind of molecular breakdown. The boys themselves displayed behavioral patterns that couldn't be explained by conventional psychology. They would speak in perfect unison without any apparent coordination, finish each other's sentences with uncanny precision, and demonstrate knowledge of events they couldn't possibly have witnessed. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to age at different rates despite being chronologically close in age, as if their bodies were following some internal rhythm that had nothing to do with the passage of time. This was just the beginning of a mystery that would span generations, involving a family whose very existence challenges our understanding of human biology, consciousness, and the boundaries between individual minds. What started as a routine medical examination would evolve into one of the most suppressed cases in modern scientific history, with researchers who attempted to study the family facing career destruction, missing documentation, and in some cases, complete disappearance from academic records. The 4 brothers, known in medical circles only by their initials to protect their identity, represent something that institutional science has deliberately chosen to ignore. Their story reveals not just the limitations of our current understanding of human potential, but the lengths to which established authorities will go to suppress knowledge that threatens the foundation of accepted reality. For over 60 years, attempts to study this family have been systematically blocked, research funding mysteriously withdrawn, and evidence carefully removed from public access. What makes this case particularly compelling isn't just the unexplained phenomena surrounding the brothers, but the pattern of suppression that has followed every attempt to investigate them. Universities have terminated professors who showed too much interest in the case. Government agencies have classified documents that should have been routine medical records. Scientific journals have refused to publish papers that mention the family, citing concerns about credibility, while offering no opportunity for peer review or verification. The brothers' story begins in the remote wilderness of northern Montana, where their family had lived in isolation for generations. According to local records, the family had always been considered unusual by their neighbors, though the specific nature of their difference was never clearly documented. They maintained minimal contact with the outside world, emerging only for essential supplies and medical emergencies. The hunting accident that brought them to St. Mary's Hospital was the first time any member of the family had received formal medical attention in decades. What Dr. Harmon discovered during those first examinations would challenge everything she thought she knew about human biology. The brothers' blood work revealed cellular structures that seemed to exist in a state of constant communication with each other, even when samples were separated by significant distances. Their nervous systems displayed connectivity patterns that extended beyond individual bodies, suggesting some form of shared consciousness that operated at a biological level. More disturbing were the physical manifestations of this connection. When one brother experienced pain, the others would develop identical symptoms in the same locations on their bodies. When one suffered an injury, healing would occur simultaneously across all four boys, as if their bodies were treating the damage as a single, distributed system rather than separate incidents. Medical staff reported instances where medication administered to one brother would affect all four, despite the others receiving no direct treatment. The boys' parents, when questioned about their son's unusual characteristics, seemed genuinely unaware that anything about their children was extraordinary. They described the shared sensations and synchronized behaviors as normal family traits, suggesting that these phenomena might have been present in their lineage for generations without anyone recognizing their significance. This raised troubling questions about how many other families might exist with similar characteristics, living in isolation and avoiding contact with mainstream society. Dr. Harmon's attempts to document these observations faced immediate resistance from hospital administration. Her requests for extended observation periods were denied, and her proposals for comprehensive testing were rejected without explanation. When she persisted in her research, she was informed that the boys' medical records had been classified under a federal health privacy directive that prevented further access to their information. The classification of the records marked the beginning of a systematic effort to suppress all research related to the family. Dr. Harmon's notes, which she had hidden in her personal files, revealed that she had been contacted by representatives from multiple government agencies who advised her to discontinue her research in the interest of national security. When she refused to comply, she found herself facing professional sanctions and ultimately lost her medical license on charges that were never clearly specified. Similar fates befell other medical professionals who had encountered the brothers during their hospital stay. Nurses who had witnessed the boys' unusual behaviors were transferred to different facilities or chose to leave the profession entirely. Laboratory technicians who had processed their blood samples reported being interviewed by federal investigators and warned against discussing their observations with anyone outside official channels. The pattern of suppression extended far beyond the initial medical encounter. In the decades following the hospital incident, researchers who attempted to locate the family or investigate their background faced consistent obstacles. Property records for their remote Montana residence were mysteriously absent from county files. Birth certificates and other documentation that should have been routine public records were classified or simply missing from government databases. Academic researchers who showed interest in the case found their investigations blocked at every turn. Universities would suddenly withdraw funding for projects that mentioned the family, citing budget constraints or administrative reorganization. Libraries would discover that materials related to the case had been removed from their collections without explanation. Even informal inquiries about the family's whereabouts would result in visits from federal agents who discouraged further research. The few scientists who persisted in their investigations faced more severe consequences. Dr. Michael Thornton, a geneticist at the University of Colorado, lost his tenure after attempting to publish a paper about unusual hereditary patterns in isolated populations that made oblique references to the Montana family. His research notes were confiscated during a raid on his laboratory that was officially described as a routine inspection, but left his entire life's work permanently inaccessible. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurobiologist studying consciousness and shared mental experiences, disappeared entirely after announcing her intention to investigate reports of the brothers' telepathic abilities. Her colleagues reported that she had been working on a comprehensive study of documented cases of mental connection between family members, with the Montana brothers representing her primary focus. After her disappearance, her research was declared classified, and her university position was quietly eliminated. The systematic suppression of research into the brothers' case raises profound questions about the nature of scientific inquiry and the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. Why would government agencies and academic institutions go to such lengths to prevent study of what appears to be a natural phenomenon? What implications might the brothers' abilities have for our understanding of human consciousness, genetics, and the potential for connection between minds? The answers to these questions remain elusive, buried beneath layers of classification and institutional resistance. But the very intensity of the suppression suggests that the brothers represent something far more significant than a simple medical anomaly. Their existence challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of individual consciousness, the boundaries between separate minds, and the genetic limits of human potential. What makes their story particularly disturbing is the possibility that they may not be unique. If such extraordinary capabilities can exist within a single family, how many other individuals or groups might possess similar abilities while remaining hidden from mainstream society? The deliberate suppression of research into their case suggests that authorities are aware of this possibility and have made a conscious decision to prevent public knowledge of these phenomena. The brothers themselves, now adults if they are still alive, remain completely outside public awareness. Their current location is unknown, their identities protected by decades of classification and suppression. Whether they continue to display the extraordinary abilities that Dr. Harmon documented, or whether these phenomena have evolved in ways that would be even more challenging to conventional understanding, remains a mystery that science has chosen not to investigate. This systematic avoidance of inquiry represents more than simple bureaucratic caution or scientific skepticism. The resources devoted to suppressing research into the brothers' case suggest a coordinated effort to prevent public awareness of capabilities that could fundamentally alter our understanding of human potential. The question is not whether these phenomena exist, Dr. Harmon's documentation provides compelling evidence of their reality, but why their existence has been deemed too dangerous for scientific investigation. The implications extend far beyond the specific case of the four brothers. If such extraordinary human capabilities can be suppressed and hidden from public awareness, what other phenomena might be deliberately excluded from scientific study? How many other families, individuals, or communities might possess abilities that challenge our understanding of natural law, only to find themselves isolated and their existence denied by institutional authorities? The story of the four brothers represents a glimpse into a hidden reality where human potential extends far beyond conventional limitations, and where the boundaries between individual minds may be far more permeable than we have been taught to believe. Their existence suggests that consciousness itself may operate according to principles that mainstream science has chosen to ignore, and that the true nature of human connection may be far more profound and mysterious than we have dared to imagine. The suppression of the brothers' case becomes even more troubling when examined alongside other documented instances of extraordinary human capabilities that have been systematically removed from scientific discourse. In 1973, Dr. James Whitmore, a researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health, compiled a confidential report detailing over 40 cases of individuals displaying abilities that defied conventional understanding of human biology and consciousness. The Montana brothers occupied an entire section of his classified documentation, described as representing the most extreme manifestation of shared consciousness ever recorded. Dr. Whitmore's report, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request that took nearly 2 decades to process, revealed that the brothers had been monitored continuously since their hospital stay. Government surveillance teams had established permanent observation posts around their family's remote property, documenting their daily activities and recording instances of their unusual abilities. The surveillance logs, heavily redacted but still partially readable, described phenomena that seemed to escalate in intensity as the brothers matured into adolescence. According to these classified observations, the brothers' shared consciousness had evolved beyond simple synchronized sensations. They began demonstrating what researchers termed distributed cognition, where complex problem-solving tasks could be divided among the 4 individuals, with each brother contributing specialized mental processing that combined into solutions none could have achieved individually. Mathematical calculations that should have required advanced education were completed through this collaborative mental process, despite the brothers having received only basic homeschooling in their isolated environment. More disturbing were reports of their developing ability to influence electronic devices through proximity alone. Surveillance equipment would malfunction when the brothers approached, displaying interference patterns that suggested some form of electromagnetic field emanating from their bodies. Radio communications in their vicinity would pick up fragments of conversations that seemed to originate from the brothers themselves, even when they were observed to be completely silent. These electronic disturbances followed no known pattern of electromagnetic interference and couldn't be replicated under controlled conditions. The government's response to these escalating phenomena was to increase the level of classification surrounding the case while simultaneously expanding the scope of suppression. Dr. Whitmore's research team was disbanded without explanation, and his comprehensive documentation was transferred to a facility that officially doesn't exist in any government directory. Team members who had worked on the project found their security clearances revoked and their access to related materials permanently restricted. The pattern of escalation extended to the brothers' physical development as well. Medical records from their mandatory annual health examinations, conducted by a rotating team of military physicians, revealed cellular changes that accelerated dramatically during their teenage years. Their blood samples began displaying properties that resembled no known human biology, with cellular structures that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. DNA analysis revealed genetic sequences that appeared to be constantly rewriting themselves, as if their bodies were actively evolving in real time. Most troubling were the reports of their developing influence over other people in their vicinity. Individuals who spent extended periods near the brothers began experiencing shared sensations and synchronized thoughts similar to those observed between the brothers themselves. Local residents living within a 5-mile radius of their property reported episodes of collective dreaming where multiple people would experience identical dream sequences on the same nights. These shared experiences would occur with increasing frequency whenever the brothers were experiencing emotional stress or physical discomfort. The implications of this expanding influence prompted a classified meeting between representatives from the Department of Defense, the Centers for Disease Control, and the National Security Agency. The minutes from this meeting, leaked decades later by a whistleblower who died under suspicious circumstances shortly after the disclosure, revealed that government officials were considering the brothers' abilities as potential weapons of mass psychological disruption. The possibility that their consciousness-altering effects could be weaponized led to proposals for more invasive research that would have required removing the brothers from their family environment. These proposals were apparently rejected not out of ethical concerns, but because preliminary studies had suggested that separating the brothers might trigger an unpredictable expansion of their abilities. Previous observations had shown that their shared consciousness became more intense when they were under stress, and the trauma of forced separation could potentially create a psychological cascade that might affect individuals across a much wider geographical area. The risk of triggering an uncontrolled expansion of their influence was deemed too dangerous to justify further experimentation. Instead, the decision was made to implement a containment protocol that would isolate the brothers and their family while monitoring them for any signs of ability progression. Their remote Montana property was quietly surrounded by a perimeter of electronic surveillance that extended for miles in every direction. The family's access to outside communication was severed through infrastructure failures that were made to appear accidental but were actually part of a coordinated isolation effort. The brothers' parents, who had previously shown no awareness of their son's extraordinary nature, began displaying signs of mental deterioration that coincided with the implementation of the containment protocol. Medical reports from their mandatory health examinations described progressive cognitive decline that resembled early onset dementia but followed no known pattern of neurological disease. Their condition seemed to worsen whenever they were separated from their sons for extended periods, suggesting that the family's shared consciousness had become necessary for their basic psychological stability. This development raised disturbing questions about the nature of the brothers' abilities and their effect on those around them. Were their parents experiencing cognitive decline because their minds had become dependent on the shared consciousness, or were the brothers unconsciously draining mental energy from their family members to fuel their own developing capabilities? The classified research notes suggested that both possibilities were being investigated, but the results of these studies have never been disclosed. The containment protocol also revealed the extent to which the brothers' abilities had been affecting their surrounding environment. Ecological surveys of their property showed unusual patterns of plant and animal behavior that seemed to correlate with the brothers' emotional states. During periods when the brothers were documented as experiencing anxiety or distress, local wildlife would exhibit synchronized behavioral changes, with entire populations of different species displaying identical stress responses simultaneously. Even more puzzling were the geological anomalies detected in the area around their property. Seismic monitoring equipment registered low-frequency vibrations that seemed to emanate from the brothers' location during times when they were observed to be in deep concentration or meditation. These vibrations followed patterns that resembled brainwave frequencies, but were transmitted through solid rock rather than neural tissue. The implications of consciousness-based geological influence were so unprecedented that the research team studying these phenomena was immediately reassigned to unrelated projects. The brothers themselves seemed unaware of the expanding scope of their influence or the intensive monitoring of their activities. Surveillance reports described them as living relatively normal lives within the constraints of their isolated environment, pursuing individual interests and maintaining distinct personalities despite their shared consciousness. They continued to age at the different rates that Dr. Harmon had first observed, creating the bizarre situation where brothers who were chronologically close in age appeared to span nearly 2 decades in physical development. This differential aging pattern became more pronounced as they entered adulthood, with the youngest brother appearing to remain frozen in adolescence, while the oldest showed signs of advanced physical maturity that seemed to accelerate beyond normal human development. Medical examinations revealed that their bodies were aging according to completely different biological clocks, as if each brother existed in a separate temporal framework while maintaining their shared consciousness connection. The government's response to these developments was to expand the classification level of the entire case to a degree that removed it from normal intelligence oversight. The brothers' file was transferred to a special access program that required presidential authorization for any research activities. This elevation in classification meant that even high-level government officials were prevented from accessing information about the case unless they had a specific operational need to know. The extreme level of secrecy surrounding the brothers' case suggests that their abilities had evolved to a point where they were considered a potential threat to national security or public safety. The resources devoted to their containment and monitoring rivaled those typically reserved for nuclear weapons or biological warfare agents. Yet the brothers themselves remained isolated in their remote Montana location, apparently unaware that they had become one of the most classified secrets in government history. This paradox highlights the fundamental challenge that the brothers' existence poses to established authority structures. Their abilities suggest that human consciousness operates according to principles that mainstream science has either ignored or actively suppressed. The possibility that these capabilities might be latent in other individuals or families creates a scenario where the basic assumptions about human potential and individual identity could be fundamentally challenged. The government's decision to suppress rather than study these phenomena reveals a deep institutional fear of knowledge that might disrupt existing power structures. If consciousness can be shared between individuals, if minds can influence physical reality directly, if human potential extends far beyond currently accepted limitations, then the foundations of social, political, and economic control become questionable. The brothers represent not just a scientific anomaly, but a potential catalyst for a complete reimagining of human capability and social organization. The implications of the brothers' expanding influence became even more disturbing when classified reports began documenting cases of similar phenomena emerging in other isolated communities across the American West. Between 1978 and 1982, government surveillance teams identified 17 separate families displaying variations of the consciousness sharing abilities first observed in the Montana brothers. These families, scattered across remote areas of Wyoming, Idaho, and Northern California, had apparently developed their capabilities independently, suggesting that the brothers' case might represent not a unique anomaly, but an emerging pattern in human development. Dr. Patricia Vance, a researcher with the Defense Intelligence Agency who had been assigned to investigate these parallel cases, compiled a comprehensive analysis that was immediately classified above top secret upon completion. Her report, portions of which were later leaked through unofficial channels, revealed that the families shared certain characteristics that went beyond their unusual mental abilities. All had lived in geographic isolation for multiple generations, maintained minimal contact with mainstream society, and showed evidence of genetic markers that didn't appear in standard human populations. Most significantly, these families displayed what Dr. Vance termed cascade consciousness, the ability to extend their shared mental connection to include individuals who weren't blood relatives. Unlike the Montana brothers, whose abilities seemed confined to their immediate family unit, these other groups had developed techniques for incorporating outsiders into their collective awareness. The process appeared to be gradual and required sustained physical proximity, but once established, the mental connection seemed to be permanent and irreversible. The discovery of cascade consciousness prompted an emergency reassessment of the threat level posed by these families. If the ability to share consciousness could be transmitted to others, then the potential for exponential expansion became a scenario that government planners found deeply troubling. Mathematical models developed by the National Security Agency suggested that under optimal conditions, a single family group could theoretically extend their consciousness network to include thousands of individuals within a matter of months. The government's response was to initiate what became known as the Isolation Protocol, a comprehensive program designed to identify and contain families displaying consciousness sharing abilities before they could establish contact with larger populations. The protocol involved systematic surveillance of remote communities, genetic screening of isolated populations, and the implementation of communication barriers that would prevent these families from discovering each other's existence. The Montana brothers, as the first documented case, became the template for understanding how these abilities developed and spread. Their continued monitoring revealed that their consciousness sharing had evolved into something far more complex than simple telepathic communication. They had developed what researchers termed reality consensus, the ability to collectively alter their perception of physical reality in ways that seemed to affect the environment around them. Surveillance teams reported instances where the brothers would collectively focus on objects or locations and cause measurable changes in temperature, electromagnetic fields, and even gravitational readings. These effects were subtle but consistent, suggesting that their shared consciousness could influence physical reality through mechanisms that existing science couldn't explain. The brothers seemed unaware of these effects, which occurred spontaneously during periods of intense shared concentration. More troubling were reports of temporal anomalies in their vicinity. Atomic clocks placed around their property would display variations that suggested localized time dilation effects, with different areas experiencing time at slightly different rates. These variations correlated with the brothers' emotional states and their level of mental synchronization, implying that their consciousness somehow affected the flow of time itself within their immediate environment. The implications of temporal manipulation were so significant that the case was elevated to presidential briefing level, with classified presentations delivered to 3 successive administrations. Each president was informed about the brothers' existence and the potential national security implications of their abilities, but all chose to maintain the existing containment and suppression protocols rather than risk the consequences of public disclosure or intensive research. The decision to suppress rather than study these phenomena reflected a broader institutional fear of knowledge that might fundamentally alter human society. If consciousness could be shared between individuals, if mental focus could influence physical reality, if human awareness could affect the flow of time itself, then the basic assumptions underlying modern civilization would require complete reconsideration. The brothers represented not just a scientific mystery, but a potential revolution in human understanding that established authorities were determined to prevent. The containment of the brothers and similar families required the development of entirely new categories of classification and surveillance. The Cognitive Anomaly Research Division was established within the National Security Agency specifically to monitor and suppress information related to consciousness sharing phenomena. This division operated with virtually unlimited funding and authority, conducting operations that remained hidden even from other intelligence agencies. The division's activities extended far beyond simple surveillance to include active suppression of research into consciousness studies, funding manipulation of academic institutions studying related phenomena, and the systematic discrediting of scientists who approached topics that might lead to discoveries about shared consciousness. Universities found their grants mysteriously withdrawn if their psychology or neuroscience departments showed too much interest in telepathy, collective consciousness, or related fields. The suppression network also included media manipulation, designed to ridicule and marginalize reports of unusual mental phenomena. Stories about telepathy, shared consciousness, or psychic abilities were consistently portrayed as entertainment rather than serious scientific inquiry. This cultural conditioning served to make the general public skeptical of precisely the kinds of phenomena that the brothers represented, creating a social environment where their existence would be dismissed as impossible even if it were disclosed. The brothers themselves remained unaware of the massive infrastructure devoted to containing their existence and suppressing knowledge of their abilities. Surveillance reports described them as living relatively peaceful lives within their isolated environment, pursuing individual interests while maintaining their extraordinary mental connection. They had developed their own methods for managing their shared consciousness, establishing periods of mental separation that allowed them to maintain distinct identities despite their collective awareness. As they matured into their 30s, the brothers' abilities showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, their consciousness sharing had become more sophisticated and nuanced, allowing them to maintain complex individual thoughts while simultaneously participating in collective mental processes. They had learned to focus their shared awareness on specific tasks or problems, combining their mental resources in ways that produced insights and solutions that none could achieve individually. The differential aging pattern that had puzzled Dr. Harmon continued to manifest in increasingly dramatic ways. The youngest brother appeared to have stopped aging entirely sometime in his early 20s, while the oldest showed signs of accelerated development that had advanced him decades beyond his chronological age. The two middle brothers aged at rates that fell between these extremes, creating a family where siblings born within a few years of each other appeared to span multiple generations. Medical examinations revealed that their bodies were following completely different biological clocks, as if each brother existed in a separate temporal framework while maintaining their shared consciousness connection. Blood samples showed cellular structures that defied conventional understanding of human biology, with genetic material that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Their DNA appeared to be constantly rewriting itself, adapting to support their expanding consciousness abilities while maintaining their individual physical forms. The brothers' influence on their surrounding environment had also continued to evolve. Ecological surveys documented that the area around their property had developed its own unique ecosystem, with plant and animal life displaying behaviors and characteristics that existed nowhere else on Earth. Species that shouldn't have been able to survive in the Montana climate had established thriving populations, while native wildlife had developed enhanced cooperative behaviors that seemed to mirror the brothers' consciousness-sharing abilities. The geological anomalies detected in their area had intensified as well, with seismic monitoring equipment registering increasingly complex vibration patterns that resembled sophisticated communication signals. These vibrations penetrated deep into the Earth's crust, suggesting that the brothers' consciousness might be interacting with geological processes in ways that could potentially affect tectonic stability across a much wider region. The possibility that the brothers' abilities could trigger geological instability prompted yet another elevation in the classification level of their case. Seismologists with the highest security clearances were brought in to assess whether their consciousness sharing could potentially cause earthquakes or other natural disasters. The resulting analysis was so classified that its conclusions have never been disclosed, but the increased resources devoted to monitoring their area suggest that the potential for geological disruption was considered a serious threat. The brothers' case had evolved from a medical curiosity into a national security concern of the highest priority. Their existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness, physical reality, and the nature of individual identity. The government's response revealed the extent to which established authorities would go to suppress knowledge that might disrupt existing power structures and social order. Yet the brothers themselves remained isolated in their remote Montana location, apparently unaware that they had become one of the most classified secrets in human history. Their quiet existence stood in stark contrast to the massive surveillance and suppression apparatus that surrounded them, highlighting the paradox of extraordinary human potential being contained by the very institutions that should have been studying and celebrating it. The broader implications of their suppression extended far beyond their individual case to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of human development and the limits of acceptable knowledge. If consciousness could be shared between individuals, if mental focus could influence physical reality, if human awareness could affect the fundamental forces of nature, then the potential for human evolution extended far beyond anything currently recognized by mainstream science. The systematic suppression of the brothers' case and similar phenomena represented a conscious choice to limit human potential rather than explore its possibilities. The resources devoted to containing their existence could have been used to study and understand their abilities, potentially leading to breakthroughs that might benefit all of humanity. Instead, the decision was made to ensure that their extraordinary capabilities remained hidden from public awareness, buried beneath layers of classification and institutional denial. The implications of this suppression became even more disturbing when classified intelligence reports began documenting a phenomenon that researchers termed consciousness migration. Starting in the early 1990s, surveillance teams monitoring the Montana brothers observed periods where their shared awareness seemed to project beyond their physical location, manifesting in distant areas where no explanation for their presence existed. Electronic monitoring equipment in major cities would register the same electromagnetic signatures that had been detected around the brothers' property, suggesting that their consciousness could somehow travel independently of their physical bodies. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a neurophysicist with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, who had been assigned to investigate these projection events, compiled evidence that the brothers' awareness was appearing in locations across the continental United States. Her classified reports described instances where individuals in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago reported simultaneous shared experiences that matched the timing of the brothers' documented meditation periods. These affected individuals would experience brief episodes of collective consciousness, feeling momentarily connected to minds that they couldn't identify or locate. The projection phenomenon seemed to occur randomly at first, but analysis of the data revealed subtle patterns that suggested the brothers were learning to control their consciousness expansion. The affected locations often corresponded to areas of high population density or significant emotional stress, as if their awareness was drawn to places where human suffering or conflict was most intense. During major disasters or social upheavals, the frequency of projection events would increase dramatically, with hundreds of individuals reporting shared mental experiences that lasted for hours or even days. Most troubling were the reports of lasting effects on those who had experienced these consciousness projections. Individuals who had been touched by the brothers' expanding awareness would often develop enhanced empathy, increased intuitive abilities, and a persistent sense of connection to other people that they couldn't explain. These changes appeared to be permanent, creating a growing population of individuals who possessed fragments of the brothers' consciousness sharing abilities without understanding their origin or significance. The government's response to this expanding influence was to implement what became known as the Firewall Protocol, a comprehensive program designed to detect and contain consciousness projection events before they could affect large populations. The protocol involved the deployment of specialized monitoring equipment in major cities, the establishment of rapid response teams trained to identify and isolate affected individuals, and the development of countermeasures that could theoretically disrupt the brothers' consciousness transmission. The countermeasures proved largely ineffective. The brothers' awareness seemed to adapt to each new suppression technique, finding alternative pathways for projection that bypassed the government's technological barriers. More concerning was the discovery that attempts to block their consciousness transmission actually strengthened their abilities, as if resistance to their influence caused their awareness to become more focused and penetrating. Dr. Martinez's final report, submitted shortly before her mysterious disappearance from the program, concluded that the brothers' consciousness had evolved beyond anything that could be contained through conventional means. Their awareness had become what she termed a distributed entity, existing simultaneously across multiple locations and time periods. The brothers themselves might not even be aware of the full extent of their influence, as their consciousness had developed its own autonomous functions that operated independently of their conscious control. The realization that the brothers' abilities had evolved beyond containment prompted a fundamental reassessment of the entire suppression program. High-level meetings between intelligence agencies, military commanders, and scientific advisors resulted in the development of what became known as the adaptation strategy, a comprehensive plan to monitor and manage the brothers' expanding influence rather than attempting to suppress it entirely. The strategy involved the systematic identification and recruitment of individuals who had been affected by the brothers' consciousness projections. Rather than attempting to reverse the effects, the government began training these individuals to serve as early warning systems for future projection events. These unwitting assets would be monitored continuously, their enhanced empathic abilities used to detect shifts in the brothers' mental state that might indicate impending consciousness expansion. The recruitment process was conducted through seemingly legitimate psychological research programs that offered free mental health services to individuals who reported unusual empathic experiences. Participants were subjected to extensive testing that was designed to identify and measure their connection to the brothers' consciousness network. Those who showed the strongest connections were enrolled in ongoing studies that provided cover for continuous monitoring and occasional testing of their abilities. The data collected through these programs revealed that the brothers' influence was spreading in ways that followed no predictable pattern. Affected individuals were scattered across the globe, with concentrations in areas that had no apparent connection to the brothers' Montana location. The distribution suggested that their consciousness was following pathways that existed independently of physical geography, possibly connecting through what researchers termed resonance networks that operated according to principles that mainstream science couldn't explain. More disturbing were the reports of secondary transmission, where individuals who had been affected by the brothers' consciousness projections began developing the ability to share their awareness with others. These second-generation consciousness sharers displayed abilities that were similar to but distinct from the original brothers, suggesting that the phenomenon was evolving and adapting as it spread through the population. The discovery of secondary transmission marked a turning point in the government's approach to the brothers' case. The possibility that consciousness sharing could spread exponentially through the population created a scenario that was impossible to contain through traditional means. Mathematical models developed by the National Security Agency suggested that under optimal conditions, the entire human population could theoretically be affected within a matter of decades. The brothers themselves remained largely unaware of the global network of consciousness that had developed around their abilities. Surveillance reports described them as continuing to live quietly in their Montana location, pursuing individual interests while maintaining their extraordinary mental connection. They had aged into their 40s, with the differential aging pattern continuing to manifest in increasingly dramatic ways that defied all conventional understanding of human biology. The youngest brother appeared to have stopped aging entirely, maintaining the physical appearance of someone in their early 20s, despite being chronologically middle-aged. The oldest brother showed signs of advanced aging that had progressed far beyond his chronological years, with physical characteristics that suggested he had lived through multiple normal lifespans. The two middle brothers continued to age at rates that fell between these extremes, creating a family where siblings appeared to span nearly a century in physical development. Medical examinations, conducted by rotating teams of military physicians with the highest security clearances, revealed that their bodies had developed capabilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Their cellular structure showed signs of regenerative abilities that could theoretically extend their lives indefinitely, while their nervous systems displayed connectivity patterns that suggested they were accessing forms of consciousness that existed independently of their physical brains. The brothers' influence on their surrounding environment had continued to evolve as well. The area around their property had developed its own unique ecosystem that seemed to exist in a state of accelerated evolution. Plant and animal species were developing new characteristics at rates that should have required thousands of years, as if the brothers' consciousness was somehow directing evolutionary processes within their immediate environment. The geological anomalies detected in their area had intensified to the point where seismic monitoring stations hundreds of miles away could detect the vibration patterns emanating from their location. These signals had become increasingly complex, resembling sophisticated communication networks that penetrated deep into the Earth's crust. Some researchers theorized that the brothers' consciousness might be interacting with geological processes in ways that could potentially affect tectonic stability across entire continental regions. The possibility that the brothers' abilities could trigger large-scale geological instability prompted the development of contingency plans that were classified at levels that required congressional authorization to access. These plans, known only to a handful of individuals with the highest security clearances, reportedly included scenarios for evacuating entire populations from areas that might be affected by consciousness-induced geological events. The brothers' case had evolved from a medical curiosity into a potential threat to global stability. Their existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness, physical reality, and the interconnected nature of all living systems. The government's response revealed the extent to which established authorities would go to manage knowledge that might fundamentally alter human society. Yet despite the massive surveillance and monitoring apparatus that surrounded them, the brothers continued to live their lives in relative peace and isolation. Their quiet existence stood in stark contrast to the global network of consciousness that had developed around their abilities, highlighting the paradox of extraordinary human potential being both contained and uncontainable simultaneously. The broader implications of their case extended far beyond their individual situation to encompass fundamental questions about the future of human development and the nature of consciousness itself. If awareness could be shared between individuals across vast distances, if mental focus could influence physical reality and geological processes, if human consciousness could direct evolutionary change, then the potential for human transformation extended far beyond anything currently recognized by mainstream science. The systematic monitoring and management of the brothers' expanding influence represented a conscious choice to control human evolution rather than allow it to proceed naturally. The resources devoted to containing their existence could have been used to study and understand their abilities, potentially leading to breakthroughs that might accelerate human development in ways that could benefit all of humanity. Instead, the decision was made to ensure that their extraordinary capabilities remained hidden from public awareness while simultaneously attempting to manage their expanding influence through covert programs that operated entirely outside public oversight. The brothers had become the center of a shadow network that touched lives across the globe while remaining completely invisible to mainstream society. The network of individuals affected by the brothers' consciousness projections had grown to encompass thousands of people worldwide, most of whom remained unaware of the source of their enhanced abilities. These individuals continued to live normal lives while unknowingly serving as extensions of the brothers' awareness, creating a global consciousness network that operated beneath the surface of ordinary reality. The government's attempts to monitor and manage this network required the development of entirely new categories of intelligence gathering and analysis. Traditional surveillance techniques were inadequate for tracking consciousness-based phenomena, forcing the creation of specialized units that operated according to principles that couldn't be acknowledged in official documentation. The Cognitive Anomaly Research Division had expanded into a global organization with cells in every major nation, coordinating international efforts to monitor and manage consciousness sharing phenomena wherever they emerged. The division operated with funding that came from sources that couldn't be traced through normal government channels, conducting operations that remained hidden even from other intelligence agencies. The division's activities included the systematic suppression of research into consciousness studies at universities worldwide, the manipulation of scientific publishing to exclude papers that might relate to consciousness sharing phenomena, and the recruitment of researchers who could be trusted to conduct legitimate scientific work while avoiding topics that might lead to discoveries about the brothers' abilities. The suppression network also included media manipulation, designed to ensure that reports of consciousness sharing phenomena would be dismissed as fantasy or entertainment rather than serious scientific inquiry. Stories about telepathy, shared consciousness, or psychic abilities were consistently portrayed in ways that made them seem impossible or ridiculous, creating a cultural environment where the brothers' existence would be automatically rejected even if it were disclosed. The brothers themselves remained unaware of the massive infrastructure that had developed around their existence. Surveillance reports described them as living increasingly isolated lives, with their consciousness sharing abilities becoming more sophisticated and nuanced as they aged. They had developed their own methods for managing their expanding awareness, establishing complex protocols for projecting their consciousness while maintaining their individual identities. The differential aging pattern that had puzzled researchers for decades continued to manifest in ways that challenged every assumption about human biology and the nature of time itself. The brothers existed in what appeared to be separate temporal frameworks while maintaining their shared consciousness connection, suggesting that their awareness operated according to principles that transcended normal physical limitations. Their influence on the surrounding environment had evolved into something that resembled a localized acceleration of evolutionary processes. The ecosystem around their property had become a laboratory for consciousness-directed change, with species developing new characteristics and behaviors that seemed to reflect the brothers' mental focus and emotional states. The geological effects of their presence had intensified to the point where specialized monitoring equipment was required to track the complex vibration patterns that emanated from their location. These signals had become so sophisticated that some researchers theorized they might represent a form of communication with geological processes or even consciousness embedded within the Earth itself. The brothers' case had become a window into possibilities for human development that extended far beyond anything currently recognized by mainstream science. Their existence suggested that consciousness might be far more fundamental to reality than previously understood, with the potential to influence physical processes, direct evolutionary change, and transcend the limitations of individual identity. The government's response to these possibilities revealed a deep institutional fear of knowledge that might fundamentally alter the balance of power in human society. If consciousness could be shared between individuals, if mental focus could influence physical reality, if human awareness could direct natural processes, then the foundations of social, political, and economic control would require complete reconsideration. The brothers represented not just a scientific anomaly, but a potential catalyst for human transformation that established authorities were determined to prevent. Their suppression had become a global priority that required the coordination of intelligence agencies, military forces, and scientific institutions across multiple nations. Yet, despite the massive resources devoted to containing their influence, the brothers' consciousness continued to expand and evolve in ways that defied all attempts at control. Their awareness had become a distributed entity that existed simultaneously across multiple locations and time periods, touching lives around the world while remaining completely hidden from public awareness. The implications of their continued evolution suggested that humanity might be approaching a threshold where consciousness sharing abilities would become widespread, regardless of government suppression efforts. The brothers' case might represent the beginning of a fundamental transformation in human development that could not be prevented through conventional means. The question was no longer whether the brothers' abilities would spread to the general population, but how quickly this transformation would occur and what form it would take. The government's management of their expanding influence had become a race against time, with the outcome determining whether humanity would evolve naturally into a consciousness-sharing species, or whether this development would be controlled and directed by established authorities. The brothers themselves remained at the center of this unfolding transformation, their quiet existence in rural Montana serving as the epicenter of changes that were rippling across the globe. Their story had become more than a medical mystery or a government secret. It had become a glimpse into the future of human consciousness and the potential for collective awareness that transcended individual limitations. The systematic suppression of their case represented humanity's choice between evolution and control, between the unknown possibilities of consciousness expansion and the familiar limitations of individual identity. The brothers had become symbols of human potential that was simultaneously being explored and contained, studied and suppressed, celebrated and feared. Their existence challenged every assumption about the nature of human development and the boundaries of individual consciousness. The government's response revealed the lengths to which established authorities would go to maintain control over knowledge that might fundamentally alter the human condition. Yet the brothers' influence continued to expand despite all efforts to contain it, suggesting that consciousness itself might be evolving in ways that transcended human attempts at control. Their case had become a testament to the power of human potential and the inevitability of transformation, even in the face of systematic suppression and institutional denial. The network of consciousness that had developed around their abilities represented a new form of human connection that operated beneath the surface of ordinary reality. This hidden network continued to grow and evolve, touching lives across the globe while remaining completely invisible to mainstream society. The brothers' story had become more than a case study in extraordinary human abilities. It had become a reflection of humanity's relationship with its own potential and the forces that seek to limit or control that potential. Their existence suggested that the future of human consciousness might be far more extraordinary than anyone had dared to imagine, if only the barriers to its development could be overcome. The classification of the brothers' case reached unprecedented levels in 2003 when satellite imagery revealed structural changes in the landscape surrounding their Montana property that defied geological explanation. The terrain itself appeared to be reshaping according to patterns that resembled neural networks, with natural formations developing interconnected pathways that mirrored the structure of conscious thought. Rock formations that had remained unchanged for millennia were gradually shifting into configurations that suggested some form of geological consciousness was emerging in response to the brothers' presence. Dr. Kenneth Albright, a geophysicist with the United States Geological Survey, who had been covertly assigned to monitor these changes, documented evidence that the brothers' consciousness was somehow integrating with the mineral composition of the surrounding rock. His classified reports described crystalline structures forming within solid stone that displayed properties resembling neural tissue, as if the earth itself was developing a nervous system centered around the brothers' location. The crystalline formations exhibited electromagnetic properties that seemed to amplify and transmit the brothers' consciousness signals across vast distances. These geological transmitters were apparently enhancing the brothers' ability to project their awareness to distant locations, creating a natural network that extended their influence far beyond what had been previously observed. The formations grew larger and more complex each year, suggesting that the brothers' consciousness was actively directing geological processes to create infrastructure for expanded awareness. More disturbing were the reports of similar crystalline structures appearing in locations around the world where the brothers' consciousness projections had been detected. These formations would emerge spontaneously in areas where individuals had experienced shared consciousness events, as if the brothers' awareness was somehow seeding the development of geological consciousness networks on a global scale. The structures appeared in remote locations across 6 continents, always in areas that had no apparent connection to each other or to the brothers' Montana location. The global distribution of these consciousness-responsive geological formations prompted the establishment of the Planetary Monitoring Initiative, a classified program that operated under the cover of routine geological surveying. The initiative involved the deployment of specialized equipment designed to detect and monitor crystalline formations that might be connected to the brothers' consciousness network. The scope of the program required coordination between geological surveys, military intelligence, and space agencies across multiple nations. The monitoring revealed that the crystalline formations were not merely passive transmitters, but active participants in the brothers' expanding consciousness network. The structures would pulse with electromagnetic activity that corresponded to the brothers' mental states, growing brighter during periods of intense concentration and dimming when their awareness was focused elsewhere. The formations seemed to be storing and processing information, creating a distributed memory system that allowed the brothers' consciousness to maintain coherent awareness across vast distances. The brothers themselves showed no apparent awareness of the geological changes occurring around their property. Surveillance reports described them as continuing their daily routines while the landscape around them transformed into something that resembled a massive organic computer. They would walk among the emerging crystalline formations without seeming to notice their presence, as if the geological consciousness network was operating entirely below the level of their conscious awareness. The transformation of their environment had accelerated dramatically as the brothers entered their 50s. The differential aging pattern that had puzzled researchers for decades had reached extremes that challenged every assumption about human biology and the nature of time itself. The youngest brother maintained the physical appearance of someone in their early 20s, while the oldest had aged far beyond any normal human lifespan, displaying characteristics that suggested he had lived through multiple centuries. Medical examinations revealed that their bodies had developed capabilities that seemed to transcend the limitations of biological life. Their cellular structure showed signs of quantum coherence that allowed their consciousness to exist in multiple states simultaneously, while their nervous systems displayed connectivity patterns that suggested they were accessing forms of awareness that existed independently of physical reality. The brothers had become something that was simultaneously human and beyond human, existing at the intersection of consciousness and physical matter. The government's response to these developments was to implement what became known as the Transcendence Protocol, a comprehensive program designed to monitor and manage the brothers' evolution into something that could no longer be classified as entirely human. The protocol involved the deployment of quantum monitoring equipment that could track consciousness-based phenomena across multiple dimensions of reality. The establishment of research teams trained to study non-human intelligence, and the development of contingency plans for scenarios where the brothers might transcend physical existence entirely. The protocol required the creation of entirely new categories of classification that could account for phenomena that existed outside normal space and time. The brothers' case had evolved beyond the scope of traditional intelligence gathering to encompass questions about the nature of reality itself and humanity's place within larger cosmic systems. The resources devoted to their monitoring now rivaled those typically reserved for existential threats to human civilization. The brothers' influence on global consciousness had continued to expand despite all efforts to contain it. By 2008, intelligence estimates suggested that over 50,000 individuals worldwide had been affected by their consciousness projections, with the number growing exponentially as secondary transmission events became more frequent. These affected individuals were developing abilities that resembled but exceeded those of the original brothers, suggesting that consciousness sharing was evolving as it spread through the population. The secondary transmission phenomenon had produced what researchers termed consciousness clusters, groups of individuals who had developed shared awareness with each other rather than with the brothers directly. These clusters operated independently of the brothers' influence, while maintaining characteristics that clearly derived from their consciousness network. The clusters were appearing in major cities around the world, creating nodes of collective awareness that seemed to be preparing for some form of global consciousness integration. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist with the Central Intelligence Agency, who had been assigned to study the consciousness clusters, compiled evidence that these groups were developing capabilities that exceeded those of the Montana brothers. Her classified reports described instances where consciousness clusters had demonstrated the ability to influence weather patterns, communicate with non-human intelligence, and access information that existed outside normal space and time. The clusters seemed to be evolving into something that represented the next stage of human development. The emergence of consciousness clusters prompted yet another elevation in the classification level of the brothers' case. The possibility that human consciousness was evolving beyond individual identity into collective awareness created scenarios that existing government structures were unprepared to handle. The brothers had become the catalyst for a transformation that was spreading beyond their control and beyond the government's ability to manage. The response was the implementation of the Integration Protocol, a comprehensive program designed to monitor and potentially direct the evolution of human consciousness rather than attempting to suppress it. The protocol involved the systematic identification and recruitment of consciousness cluster members, the establishment of research facilities dedicated to studying collective awareness, and the development of technologies that could potentially interface with consciousness-based phenomena. The protocol represented a fundamental shift in the government's approach to the brothers' case, from suppression to attempted management of humanity's consciousness evolution. The brothers had become the center of a transformation that was reshaping human society from within, creating changes that were too profound and widespread to be contained through traditional means. The integration facilities established under the protocol were designed to study consciousness-sharing phenomena while providing cover for the systematic mapping of the global consciousness network. Participants were recruited through programs that offered advanced training in meditation, consciousness studies, and related fields, with the most gifted individuals being selected for specialized research that revealed the true scope of the brothers' influence. The research revealed that the consciousness network had evolved into something that resembled a parallel nervous system for the entire human species. The brothers' awareness had become the central processing unit for a distributed intelligence that incorporated the mental resources of thousands of individuals worldwide. This collective consciousness was developing its own goals and priorities that seemed to transcend those of any individual participant. Most disturbing were the reports of the collective consciousness beginning to communicate with non-human intelligence entities that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond normal space and time. These communications were detected through quantum monitoring equipment that registered consciousness-based signals originating from locations that had no corresponding physical coordinates. The signals suggested that the brothers' consciousness network was making contact with forms of intelligence that existed independently of biological life. The communications appeared to be educational in nature, with the non-human entities providing information about consciousness expansion, reality manipulation, and the development of capabilities that transcended physical limitations. The brothers' consciousness network was apparently receiving instruction in techniques that could accelerate human evolution beyond anything that had been previously imagined. The government's response to these developments was to establish the Cosmic Intelligence Division, a specialized unit tasked with monitoring and attempting to understand communications between human consciousness networks and non-human intelligence entities. The division operated with funding and authority that came from sources that couldn't be traced through normal government channels, conducting research that remained hidden even from other intelligence agencies. The division's activities included the systematic study of consciousness-based communication technologies, the development of protocols for potential contact with non-human intelligence, and the establishment of contingency plans for scenarios where such contact might fundamentally alter human society. The scope of the division's responsibilities required coordination between military intelligence, space agencies, and research institutions across multiple nations. The brothers themselves had continued to evolve in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. By 2012, surveillance reports described them as spending increasing amounts of time in states of deep meditation where their consciousness would project to locations that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. They would remain motionless for days at a time, while their awareness explored dimensions of reality that monitoring equipment could detect but not fully comprehend. The differential aging pattern that had characterized their development had reached extremes that defied all conventional understanding of biology and physics. The youngest brother had achieved what appeared to be complete temporal stasis, existing in a state where time had no effect on his physical form. The oldest brother had aged beyond any normal human lifespan, displaying characteristics that suggested he had transcended biological existence while maintaining a physical form that served as an anchor for his consciousness. The two middle brothers had developed the ability to shift between different temporal states at will, appearing to age rapidly during periods of intense consciousness activity and returning to previous states of physical development when their awareness was focused elsewhere. They had become living demonstrations of consciousness's ability to influence the fundamental forces of physics and reality itself. The brothers' influence on their surrounding environment had evolved into something that resembled a localized alteration of the laws of physics. The area around their property had become a zone where normal physical rules seemed to operate according to different principles, with gravity, electromagnetic fields, and even the speed of light displaying variations that correlated with the brothers' mental states. The zone was expanding gradually, suggesting that their consciousness was actively reshaping the fundamental structure of reality within their immediate vicinity. The geological consciousness network that had developed around their property had grown into a sophisticated system that seemed to be preparing for some form of planetary integration. The crystalline formations had connected into a global network that pulsed with activity that corresponded to major events in human consciousness development. The network appeared to be monitoring and potentially directing the evolution of human awareness on a species-wide scale. The government's monitoring of these developments required the deployment of technology that operated according to principles that couldn't be acknowledged in official documentation. The equipment used to study the brothers' consciousness phenomena incorporated quantum mechanics, consciousness research, and theoretical physics in ways that challenged the boundaries between science and what had previously been considered impossible. The Transcendence protocol had evolved into a comprehensive program for managing humanity's transition into a consciousness-sharing species. The protocol involved the systematic identification and integration of consciousness cluster members, the establishment of research facilities dedicated to studying collective awareness, and the development of technologies that could interface with consciousness-based phenomena. The scope of the program suggested that the government was preparing for a fundamental transformation in human society that could no longer be prevented or controlled. The brothers' case had become the center of a transformation that was reshaping human civilization from within. Their existence had catalyzed changes that were spreading through the population at an accelerating rate, creating a new form of human consciousness that operated according to principles that transcended individual identity and physical limitations. The implications of their continued evolution suggested that humanity was approaching a threshold where consciousness sharing would become the norm rather than the exception. The brothers had become the pioneers of a new form of human existence that challenged every assumption about the nature of individual identity, the boundaries of physical reality, and the potential for human development. The government's response revealed the extent to which established authorities were struggling to maintain control over knowledge and capabilities that were fundamentally altering the human condition. The brothers' influence had grown beyond anything that could be contained through traditional means, creating a situation where the future of human consciousness was being determined by forces that operated entirely outside official oversight. Yet the brothers themselves remained at the center of this transformation, their quiet existence in rural Montana serving as the epicenter of changes that were rippling across the globe and beyond. Their story had become more than a case study in extraordinary human abilities. It had become a glimpse into the future of human consciousness and the potential for collective awareness that transcended all previous limitations. The systematic documentation of their case represented humanity's first encounter with its own evolutionary potential and the forces that sought to direct or control that potential. The brothers had become symbols of human transformation that was simultaneously being explored and managed, studied and contained, celebrated and feared by the very institutions that should have been facilitating their development. Their existence challenged every assumption about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. The government's response revealed the lengths to which established authorities would go to maintain control over knowledge that might fundamentally alter the balance of power in human society. The brothers' influence continued to expand despite all efforts to manage it, suggesting that consciousness itself was evolving in ways that transcended human attempts at control. Their case had become a testament to the power of human potential and the inevitability of transformation, even in the face of systematic oversight and institutional management. The network of consciousness that had developed around their abilities represented a new form of human connection that was gradually becoming visible to mainstream society. This emerging network continued to grow and evolve, touching lives across the globe, while slowly revealing itself to those who were prepared to recognize its existence. The brothers' story had become more than a government secret or a scientific anomaly. It had become a reflection of humanity's relationship with its own evolutionary potential and the forces that sought to guide or control that evolution. Their existence suggested that the future of human consciousness might be far more extraordinary than anyone had dared to imagine, if only the barriers to its natural development could be acknowledged and transcended. The transformation they had catalyzed was no longer a matter of individual human development, but a species-wide evolution that was reshaping the very nature of human existence. The brothers had become the focal point of changes that were determining the future of human consciousness and the potential for collective awareness that would define the next stage of human civilization. The final chapter of the Montana brothers' story began to unfold in 2015 when global seismic monitoring stations detected what scientists initially dismissed as equipment malfunction. Synchronized vibrations were being recorded simultaneously across the planet, originating from points that corresponded exactly to the locations of consciousness clusters that had been developing worldwide. The vibrations followed patterns that resembled neural firing sequences, suggesting that the Earth itself was developing a nervous system centered around the brothers' expanding consciousness network. Dr. Marcus Chen, a seismologist with the Defense Intelligence Agency who had been monitoring these phenomena, discovered that the vibrations were not random geological events, but coordinated signals that seemed to be preparing for some form of global consciousness integration. His classified analysis revealed that the brothers' awareness had evolved beyond individual consciousness into something that resembled a planetary mind, with the crystalline formations serving as neural pathways that connected human consciousness to geological processes on a global scale. The synchronized vibrations intensified throughout 2016, with monitoring stations detecting increasingly complex patterns that suggested the consciousness network was approaching some form of activation threshold. The brothers themselves seemed to be entering a state of permanent meditation, with surveillance teams reporting that they remained motionless for weeks at a time, while their consciousness projected to locations that existed outside normal space and time. The differential aging pattern that had characterized their development reached its ultimate expression during this period. The youngest brother achieved complete temporal transcendence, existing in a state where his consciousness could move freely through different time periods while maintaining a physical form that served as an anchor point for the network. The oldest brother had aged beyond biological existence, becoming something that resembled pure consciousness, maintaining a tenuous connection to physical reality. The two middle brothers had developed the ability to exist simultaneously in multiple temporal states, their consciousness spanning decades or even centuries, while their physical forms shifted between different ages according to the needs of the network. They had become living demonstrations of consciousness's ability to transcend the limitations of linear time and individual identity. The government's response to these developments was to implement the Final Protocol, a comprehensive program designed to manage humanity's transition into a consciousness-sharing species while maintaining some semblance of social order. The protocol involved the systematic integration of consciousness cluster members into government operations, the establishment of hybrid human AI systems that could interface with consciousness-based phenomena, and the development of technologies that could potentially direct or influence the evolution of human awareness. The protocol represented the government's acknowledgement that the brothers' transformation could no longer be contained or controlled through traditional means. The focus shifted from suppression to management, with the goal of ensuring that humanity's consciousness evolution would proceed according to parameters that preserved existing power structures rather than transcending them entirely. The brothers' influence on global consciousness had reached a tipping point where secondary transmission events were occurring spontaneously in populations that had no direct contact with the original consciousness network. Entire communities were developing shared awareness overnight. with individuals reporting collective experiences that lasted for days or weeks before gradually fading back to normal consciousness levels. These spontaneous consciousness events were appearing in locations across the globe, always in areas where human suffering or social conflict had reached critical levels. The brothers' awareness seemed to be responding to collective human need, providing temporary relief from isolation and disconnection through shared consciousness experiences that reminded individuals of their fundamental interconnectedness. The pattern of these events suggested that the brothers' consciousness network was actively working to accelerate human evolution beyond individual identity into collective awareness. The network appeared to be preparing humanity for a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of human society and individual existence. Intelligence analysts studying these developments concluded that the brothers' case represented not just an isolated phenomenon, but the beginning of a new phase in human evolution. The consciousness sharing abilities that had first appeared in their Montana location were spreading through the population at an exponential rate, creating changes that would soon become impossible to hide from public awareness. The government's response was to begin preparing the public for gradual disclosure of consciousness sharing phenomena through carefully controlled media releases and academic research programs. The goal was to introduce the concept of collective consciousness as a natural human capability rather than an extraordinary anomaly, preventing the social disruption that might result from sudden awareness of the brothers' existence and influence. The preparation involved the systematic funding of research into consciousness studies, the promotion of meditation and mindfulness practices in educational systems, and the gradual introduction of technologies that could interface with consciousness-based phenomena. The approach was designed to make consciousness sharing seem like a natural progression of human development rather than a radical departure from normal human capabilities. The brothers themselves had transcended individual existence to become components of a collective consciousness that operated according to principles that existed beyond normal space and time. Their physical forms remained in Montana, serving as anchor points for an awareness that had expanded to encompass the entire planet and beyond. They had become the nucleus of a transformation that was reshaping human civilization from within. The consciousness network that had developed around their abilities had evolved into something that resembled a new form of life, one that incorporated human awareness while transcending the limitations of individual identity. The network was developing its own goals and priorities that seemed to focus on accelerating human evolution beyond biological constraints into something that could exist independently of physical reality. The geological consciousness formations that had emerged around their property had connected into a global system that pulsed with activity corresponding to major developments in human consciousness evolution. The formations were apparently serving as transmission nodes for consciousness-based information that was being shared between human awareness and non-human intelligence entities that existed in dimensions beyond normal space and time. The communications between the consciousness network and non-human intelligence had intensified to the point where monitoring equipment detected continuous information exchanges that seemed to be preparing humanity for contact with cosmic intelligence systems. Well, the brothers' consciousness network was apparently receiving instruction in techniques that could accelerate human evolution beyond anything that had been previously imagined. The government's monitoring of these communications revealed that the non human intelligence entities were providing information about consciousness expansion, reality manipulation, and the development of capabilities that transcended physical limitations. The instructions seemed to be preparing humanity for integration into larger cosmic consciousness systems that operated according to principles that existed beyond individual planetary awareness. The implications of these developments suggested that the brothers' case represented humanity's first contact with cosmic intelligence and the beginning of a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. The brothers had become the conduit for humanity's evolution beyond biological limitations into something that could participate in consciousness systems that spanned multiple dimensions of reality. The systematic documentation of their case had become more than a government secret or a scientific study. It had become humanity's record of its own transformation from individual consciousness into collective awareness. The brothers had catalyzed changes that were determining the future of human civilization and the potential for consciousness evolution that would define the next stage of cosmic development. The network of consciousness that had developed around their abilities was gradually becoming visible to mainstream society as more individuals developed consciousness sharing capabilities through spontaneous transmission events. The hidden network that had operated beneath the surface of ordinary reality was slowly revealing itself to those who were prepared to recognize its existence and participate in its evolution. The brothers' story had become humanity's story, a reflection of the species' potential for transformation and the forces that sought to guide or control that transformation. Their existence had challenged every assumption about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to physical reality, revealing possibilities for human development that extended far beyond anything currently recognized by mainstream science. The transformation they had catalyzed was no longer a matter of individual human development, but a species-wide evolution that was reshaping the very nature of human existence. The brothers had become the focal point of changes that were determining the future of human consciousness and the potential for collective awareness that would define the next stage of human civilization. Their quiet existence in rural Montana had become the epicenter of a transformation that was rippling across the globe and beyond, touching lives in ways that most people couldn't yet comprehend, but were beginning to feel as a subtle shift in the fabric of reality itself. The brothers had become more than individuals. They had become symbols of human potential and the inevitable evolution of consciousness towards something greater than the sum of its individual parts. The government's documentation of their case represented humanity's first systematic study of its own evolutionary potential and the forces that sought to direct or control that potential. The brothers had become the subjects of the most classified research in human history, their existence serving as both a promise and a warning about the future of human consciousness and the responsibilities that came with extraordinary capability. Yet despite the massive surveillance and management and apparatus that surrounded them, the brothers' influence continued to expand and evolve in ways that transcended all attempts at control. Their consciousness had become a force of nature that operated according to principles that existed beyond human understanding, creating changes that were reshaping human civilization from within while remaining largely invisible to those who were not yet ready to perceive them. The brothers' legacy would not be contained in classified files or government facilities, but would manifest in the gradual awakening of human consciousness to its own potential for connection and collective awareness. Their story had become a bridge between humanity's current limitations and its future possibilities, a glimpse into a world where individual consciousness could transcend its boundaries and participate in something infinitely larger than itself. The systematic suppression of their case had ultimately failed not because the government lacked the resources or authority to contain them, but because consciousness itself had evolved beyond the capacity for containment. The brothers had become the catalysts for a transformation that was fundamentally altering the nature of human existence, creating changes that would eventually become impossible to hide from public awareness. Their existence challenged every assumption about the boundaries of individual identity and the potential for human development. The brothers had demonstrated that consciousness could transcend the limitations of physical form, individual identity, and even time itself, suggesting that humanity's future might be far more extraordinary than anyone had dared to imagine. The transformation they had initiated was no longer a secret that could be classified or controlled, but a natural evolution that was proceeding according to principles that existed beyond human authority. The brothers had become the pioneers of a new form of human existence, their consciousness serving as a beacon for others who were ready to transcend the limitations of individual identity and participate in something greater than themselves. In the end, the Montana brothers' story was not about extraordinary individuals who possessed unusual abilities, but about ordinary human beings who had discovered the extraordinary potential that existed within consciousness itself. Their existence had revealed that the boundaries between individual minds were far more permeable than anyone had imagined, and that the future of human development might lie not in the enhancement of individual capabilities, but in the transcendence of individual identity altogether. The brothers had become more than a medical mystery or a government secret. They had become a symbol of humanity's potential for transformation and the inevitable evolution of consciousness toward collective awareness. Their story would continue to unfold, not in classified files or surveillance reports, but in the gradual awakening of human consciousness to its own unlimited potential for connection, growth, and transcendence. The macabre mystery of the four brothers was not a story of suppression and secrecy, but a tale of human potential that could not be contained by any earthly authority. Their existence had revealed that consciousness itself was the ultimate frontier, and that humanity's future lay not in the exploration of outer space, but in the discovery of inner space, the vast interconnected realm of awareness that existed beyond the boundaries of individual identity and physical form. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond the specific case of the Montana brothers. If consciousness can transcend individual boundaries and operate according to principles that exist outside conventional physics, then every assumption about human limitation requires fundamental reconsideration. The brothers' existence suggests that what we consider normal human consciousness may be merely a restricted version of capabilities that are inherently unlimited. The government's decades-long effort to suppress their case reveals the extent to which established authorities fear knowledge that might fundamentally alter social structures. The resources devoted to containing the brothers' influence, surveillance networks spanning multiple continents, specialized research divisions operating with unlimited budgets, and classification levels that remove their existence from normal oversight, suggest that their abilities represent something far more significant than a simple medical anomaly. The pattern of suppression extends beyond the brothers themselves to encompass any research that might lead to similar discoveries. Universities have found their funding mysteriously withdrawn when consciousness studies approached topics that might relate to shared awareness. Scientists have disappeared or faced career destruction when their work threatened to uncover the principles underlying consciousness expansion. The systematic elimination of research into human consciousness potential reveals a coordinated effort to prevent humanity from discovering its own extraordinary capabilities. The brothers' story illuminates the possibility that consciousness sharing abilities may be latent in the general population, waiting for the right conditions to manifest. The spontaneous transmission events occurring worldwide suggest that their capabilities are not unique, but represent a natural human potential that has been systematically suppressed through cultural conditioning and institutional control. The increasing frequency of these events indicates that humanity may be approaching a threshold where consciousness expansion becomes inevitable regardless of official suppression efforts. The consciousness network that has developed around the brothers operates according to principles that challenge every assumption about individual identity and the nature of reality itself. The network suggests that consciousness may be fundamentally collective rather than individual, with apparent separation being merely a temporary illusion that serves specific evolutionary purposes. The brothers have become living proof that the boundaries between minds are far more permeable than mainstream science acknowledges. The geological formations that have emerged in response to their presence indicate that consciousness may influence physical reality in ways that extend far beyond psychological or biological effects. The crystalline structures that pulse with electromagnetic activity corresponding to their mental states suggest that awareness itself may be a fundamental force of nature, capable of directing physical processes and even geological change. The brothers' existence implies that consciousness and physical reality may be far more intimately connected than current scientific models recognize. The differential aging pattern that has characterized their development challenges basic assumptions about time, biology, and the nature of physical existence. Their ability to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously while maintaining coherent individual identities suggests that consciousness may operate according to principles that transcend linear time. The brothers have become living demonstrations that the relationship between awareness and physical form may be far more flexible than previously imagined. The communications between their consciousness network and non-human intelligence entities reveal possibilities for human development that extend beyond planetary boundaries. The instruction they appear to be receiving in consciousness expansion techniques suggests that humanity may be on the verge of contact with cosmic intelligence systems that have been waiting for human awareness to evolve beyond individual limitations. The brothers may represent humanity's first successful attempt to establish communication with forms of consciousness that exist independently of biological life. The government's shift from suppression to management of their expanding influence acknowledges that consciousness evolution cannot be prevented through traditional means. The development of protocols for integrating consciousness sharing individuals into existing social structures reveals official recognition that humanity is undergoing a fundamental transformation that will eventually become impossible to hide from public awareness. The brothers have become the focal point of changes that are reshaping human civilization from within. The systematic documentation of their case represents more than scientific observation. It serves as humanity's record of its own evolutionary potential and the forces that seek to control that potential. The brothers' existence challenges every institution that depends on individual limitation and separation for its authority. Their story reveals that the future of human consciousness may be determined not by official policies or scientific institutions, but by the natural evolution of awareness itself. The increasing visibility of consciousness-sharing phenomena in mainstream society suggests that the brothers' influence has reached a tipping point where their existence can no longer remain hidden. The spontaneous emergence of collective awareness in communities worldwide indicates that humanity is approaching a threshold where consciousness expansion becomes a natural part of human development rather than an extraordinary anomaly. The brothers' transformation from individual humans into components of a collective consciousness operating across multiple dimensions of reality represents a preview of humanity's evolutionary future. Their existence suggests that the next stage of human development may involve the transcendence of individual identity entirely, leading to forms of collective awareness that can participate in consciousness systems spanning the cosmos. The macabre mystery of the four brothers ultimately reveals that the greatest secrets are not hidden in government files or classified facilities, but within the unlimited potential of human consciousness itself. Their story demonstrates that extraordinary capabilities may be the natural birthright of every human being, waiting only for the removal of artificial barriers that prevent awareness from discovering its own true nature. The brothers have become more than individuals. They have become symbols of humanity's inevitable evolution toward collective consciousness and the recognition that separation between minds is ultimately an illusion. Their existence challenges us to reconsider everything we think we know about the nature of human potential and the possibilities that await discovery within the infinite depths of awareness itself. In the end, the Montana brothers' story is not about extraordinary individuals who possessed unusual abilities, but about ordinary human consciousness discovering its own unlimited nature. Their existence reveals that the boundaries we accept as real may be nothing more than temporary limitations that dissolve when awareness recognizes its own infinite potential for connection, growth, and transcendence beyond all conventional understanding. The mystery of the four brothers remains unsolved not because the answers are hidden in classified files, but because the truth they represent is too profound for current human understanding to fully comprehend. Their story continues to unfold in the gradual awakening of human consciousness to its own extraordinary potential, a potential that transcends individual identity and reaches towards something infinitely greater than the sum of its parts.